Welcome to our panel. I'm going to introduce our panelists one by one, and they can come up on the stage. First is Ben Taub, writer for The New Yorker, knows a great deal about Syria and the Middle East. Leila Fadel, a correspondent for National Public Radio. At the moment, she is a Murrow Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. And Mohamad Bazzi, a recovering former journalist who is now a professor at NYU. You know, when we were asked to do this panel and have this evening, since we're all friends, I can tell you that we've had a revolving door of panelists because people work. And especially if you're a Middle East correspondent, you get called to go. And you can't really say, oh gosh, I have a panel at the International House, you have to go. So, you know, people have come and gone on this panel, and when you start thinking about focusing it, it makes it a little difficult because we weren't really sure who was going to be here tonight. And at some moment I said, let's just bring all 82 of you up here. You can all be on the panel. So I think one of the ways that we do this, because you're as smart as we are on the region, is we will talk a bit and then we will open it to questions, and I think that we will all learn something from each other. We're all watching the Middle East. We're all watching it in the age of Trump. The landscape has changed fundamentally since the last administration, and I hope that we can address where we're going, if we know yet, and what the consequences will be. So I wanted to ask each of the panelists to just spend about 3 minutes, you know, talking about what they're doing and you know, where they think the region is going in their sort of area of expertise. And then I'll ask some questions, and then we will open it to the floor. And our first questioners will be students here from International House. So let me start with Ben.
Sure. So for the past couple of years, I've been working on writing about Syria with a specific focus on war crimes, investigations, and political obstacles to accountability. And in that respect, I think we're entering an increasingly troubled time, as I guess in frankly every other respect. But if you take, for instance, looking at Syria, which is, it's the conflict in which the largest and most damning collection of evidence in history has taken place, and yet there is no path whatsoever to prosecution for the high and highest level officials, owing to obstruction at the UN Security Council. And a story that came out yesterday that was new and I think indicative of the direction we may be going is not just the Russians and the Chinese blocking a measure at the council to investigate or to condemn Assad for the use of chemical weapons, but also Bolivia and 3 other countries abstaining from the condemnation. Trump is not a person who has any grasp of what's going on in the region, never has. The fact that he's now the president doesn't change his his lack of understanding of the region or his tendency toward autocracy, his preference for conspiracy and simplistic explanations. And I think he hasn't really announced any clear Syria policy, but I don't think that that's necessarily indicative of a hidden strategy as he had claimed with his so-called Islamic State strategy, but more that he just doesn't have one, and almost guessing what it might be is a fruitless exercise because he has no idea. Beyond the obvious tendency toward so-called stability through strongman strength and repression, which is exactly how Assad and Putin have effectively won, or at least changed the war in a way that makes it impossible to see a plausible and peaceful removal of the leadership and accountability down the line.
Leila?
So I've been working in the Middle East the last 11 years, and I was most recently in Egypt for 5 years and covered Libya and Tunisia. And I think we all kind of can see that there is no actual policy in the Middle East, but a lot of the autocrats that I covered in the Middle East recognize themselves in the new leader of the United States. And so I think there may be a lot of fear from Muslims based on the very clear, like, Muslims are bad kind of policies that we're hearing from the Trump administration. But the actual leadership, I think, sees an opportunity. The US has long at least played at being the sheriff when it comes to the human rights. They might not follow through, but they'll give you the slap on the wrist, don't jail those journalists, that kind of thing. That maybe doesn't exist anymore. And as was mentioned earlier, for the first time, we're talking about similar issues right here in the United States. So people like Sisi and other leaders like him may see this as an opportunity to say, hey, the US, who has not listened to us when we said that the Muslim Brotherhood, the biggest political opponent of the administration there, is a terrorist organization, maybe now they'll say, yeah, it is a terrorist organization, which will have huge ramifications not only in the region, but also here in the United States and Canada, where organizations have connections to this, not only religious, but political organizations. So when I look at that's what has struck me so far, this sort of eagerness almost, especially, Sisi was one of the first leaders, I think maybe the first leader that called. There was like a video call and a telegram. Sisi did the call, Putin did the telegram, and Netanyahu did the video. I think that's what it was.
Someone tweeted.
Yeah, someone else tweeted. So that's what I really see, a lot of this type of language that I heard in the Middle East, and now that I'm back in the States, I'm now hearing here in English from this administration.
Mohamad?
So I'm working on a book about the competition and the conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and how it's helped define the region in the last decade, and actually really the last 4 decades or so since the revolution in '79. And I think one of the ways it pertains to what's going on today, well, I'll back up for a minute, because I just had a conversation about this before we got to the stage, where I was forced to summarize my argument in 2 sentences. And when I'm forced to do that, I say this, that it's often misunderstood as a purely sectarian conflict, as this deep-rooted, deeply held conflict between Sunnis and Shia, and that therefore it can never be resolved because it goes back 1,400 years, which that part of the conflict does. But most of the time it is actually a political competition. It's a political battle between the two for power projection in the region and for influence in the region. And we see the Trump administration is going to have to make some decisions, and Trump is going to have to make some decisions on that very soon. And one of the things one of his priorities has been containing Iran, which has actually done very destructive things in the region in the past few decades, but certainly in the last 6 years or so. I mean, since the Syria war, as Ben and others have documented, and all of us here all of us in the room have done some elements of this, of what Iran has done in different parts of the region. But what Trump will end up facing is this problem of his number one goal, he says, is also to defeat ISIS. And when he tries to do that on the ground, especially in Iraq and Syria now, which looms even larger, he's not going to be able to achieve both things at once. He's not going to be able to effectively confront ISIS and at the same time isolate Iran and take on Iran in the way that he thinks he wants to, or he says he wants to do. And also, he doesn't want to commit a lot of U.S. troops. So all those 3 things together are not going to work. And Iran can cause a lot of trouble for the U.S. in the small, scaled-down presence it has in Iraq now, all over the region. And also, it can unwind a lot of what's been done against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. So I think we need to watch how. And as we've seen so far, this is not an administration that handles nuance too well. So it's going to be a big problem.